Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a privilege and honor to be speaking at TEDxHarare on this beautiful day in Zimbabwe. My topic is Zimbabwe, waiting for the future. For almost two decades, Zimbabweans have waited patiently for better days. Zimbabwe was once considered to be the jewel of Africa. Like any jewel, it has to go through a process of refinement. And that process begins with crushing, being exposed to extremely high temperatures, cutting, and finally polishing. Zimbabwe is no different. Over the last 2 decades, Zimbabwe has undergone that process of refinement. Before I begin, I'd like to share my own personal experience with you. As a young boy growing up in Bulawayo, in the southern part of Zimbabwe, I was exposed to poverty at a young age. I couldn't understand why some people lived in big houses and had 3 cars, while a family of 6 shared a little room in the high-density suburbs. I couldn't understand, as I was driving to school, there were children walking barefoot almost 10 kilometers in order to educate themselves. It was this experience that led me to study economics. I wanted to understand how economies worked. I wanted to understand what I could do to make a difference to those lives of the people that I cared most about. After graduating with my degree in economics from the University of Warwick, I returned back to Zimbabwe in 1996, full of hope, full of optimism. Like many Zimbabweans sitting here today will remember, at that stage, Zimbabwe was considered the breadbasket of Africa. It was considered the jewel of Africa. I will come back and relate the rest of my story as we go through the presentation. But before I talk about Zimbabwe, I'd like to provide some context, an African context. What's going on in Africa? Before we look at Zimbabwe, let's consider what's going on in Africa. In May 2000, the highly respected Economist magazine referred to Africa as the hopeless continent. Almost a decade later, The Economist will almost retract that statement, and in May 2010 had an article called Africa Rising. So what's changed in Africa, and what does the rest of Africa look like today? Africa's combined GDP is around $1.6 trillion. This is roughly the size of Brazil, Russia, and India. With combined consumer spending of $860 billion, Africa is rapidly becoming an important destination for global corporates. Over the last decade, Africa has had the fastest growth in mobile phone subscribers in the world. In 2008, there were 316 million mobile subscribers. I looked at the numbers the other day. Mobile phone subscribers have now reached 700 million people. That is 700 million people today in Africa have mobile phones. To put this into context, in 2000, if you lived in Nigeria, there were only 20,000 landlines. If you required a phone, a landline, you would have to wait 10 years before you were allocated a line. Today, there are 134 million mobile phone subscribers in Nigeria, and that market is growing. This has transformed the way Africans do business. The impact on GDP of mobile phones cannot be underestimated. It is estimated that for every 10% increase in mobile penetration, GDP grows by 0.25%, and in some countries even higher. The other benefit that Africa has is it has 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land. For many countries in the world, especially in the Middle East, this is very, very important, especially for food security. And Africa is rapidly becoming a destination for agricultural companies looking to produce agricultural product in Africa. So what will Africa look like tomorrow? By 2020, Africa's collective GDP would have grown to $2.6 trillion. Consumer spending would have almost doubled to $1.4 trillion. But for me, the most important statistic on this page is the third one. Africa will have the highest proportion of working age population in the world by 2040. This is significantly higher than China and India today. There will be 1.1 billion young Africans looking for a job. This poses a significant threat to African governments, including Zimbabwe. How do we find employment for the 1 billion people that will enter the job market over the next 3 decades? This chart illustrates the growth that we've seen in Africa over the last decade, 3 decades. You can see that Africa is the second fastest growing region in the world after emerging and developing Asia. And when the world went into recession, when the world went into crisis in 2008, Africa was resilient and still produced positive GDP growth. This transformation that is taking place in Africa has not gone unnoticed. The world has realized the changes that are taking place in Africa. And this is illustrated on this chart here, where FDI flows over the last decade have grown 7-fold, from less than $10 billion in 2000 to over $80 billion in FDI flows to Africa. So moving closer to home, and the subject of my discussion today, Zimbabwe. How has Zimbabwe performed over the last 2 decades against this backdrop? Well, sadly, Zimbabwe has not participated in the African growth story. It's been unfortunate for the generation of people that have lived through this. When Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980, it was considered the jewel of Africa. With its abundant natural resources, fertile soils, highly educated population, we know this. Literacy rates in Zimbabwe are amongst the highest in Africa at 92%. At that time, Zimbabwe had good infrastructure, and when compared to other African countries, still has good infrastructure. It also had a very stable political and macroeconomic environment. And this is important. This is critically important for foreign investors. That's what's changed in Zimbabwe today. We no longer have a stable political and economic environment. What's interesting, what I found interesting, is post-independence, between 1980 and 1997, Zimbabwe had an average growth rate of 4%. That's almost twice the growth rate of the rest of Africa. Zimbabwe was the poster child for Africa. It was the country that had the greatest hope for the continent. But something changed. And in 1997, I decided to, as I said, came back from university, full of hope and optimism of a better Zimbabwe. That hope and that optimism of a better Zimbabwe were dashed. Because from 1997 through to 2008, Zimbabwe's GDP declined by over 50%. In 1997, GDP was around $10 billion. By 2008, Zimbabwe's GDP had fallen to less than $4 billion. I've shown you the changes that were going on in Zambia, and this chart illustrates that more clearly. Per capita GDP in Zimbabwe and Zambia were almost equal when Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980. But you see that reverse in 2000. And that coincided with the implementation, the fast-track implementation of the land reform program in Zimbabwe. It also coincided with the payout of $50,000 lump sum payment and $2,000 a month to war veterans in 1999. But that really signaled the beginning of the end for Zimbabwe. And what you've seen over the last 2 decades, Zambia has grown it, almost trebled its GDP from $600 per capita to almost $1,800 today. So, what hope is there for Zimbabwe? How do we make Zimbabwe a better place? How do we improve the quality of life of the average Zimbabwean? First and foremost, Zimbabwe needs to adopt a more friendly investment policy. Investors should feel welcome when visiting Zimbabwe. The second thing that Zimbabwe needs to do is resolve its outstanding debt with the IMF and the World Bank. Thirdly, Zimbabwe needs to become less political. Unfortunately, the focus has been on politics. For almost 3 decades, we focused on politics at the expense of the economy. Going back to that period, 2008, Zimbabwe boasted, well, not boasted, but during that period of hyperinflation, Zimbabwe experienced the second highest rate of inflation in the history of the world. At its peak in November 2008, inflation reached 79.6 billion %. I almost didn't have enough zeros on that table. That translates to 98% inflation a day. For those who still don't understand that, prices doubled every 24 hours. These are some of the images of that time. I've never heard of a starving billionaire. Neither have I seen street kids walking around with so much money. In fact, during that period, someone told me that street kids had set up trading accounts on the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange in order to preserve the value of their daily loot. These were the most difficult times for Zimbabwe. And in 2008, the economy faced collapse. I'm sure some of you will remember the highest denomination of note ever printed, which was the $100 trillion. But in 2008, before I go to 2008, I want to share with you what John Maynard Keynes has to say about inflation. And I'm not sure how many people realize what actually took place during this period of hyperinflation. John Maynard Keynes says, there is no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debunk the currency. The process engages all the hidden forces of economic law on the side of destruction, and does it in a manner that not one man in a million is able to diagnose. Many of you sitting here today went through that process. In less than a decade, people who had money found themselves penniless. Their savings were wiped out. Their lives had changed forever because of the evils of hyperinflation. But that came to an end. And in 2008, the ruling party, ZANU-PF, was forced to enter into GNU following violent and contested elections. And we've heard about that from the speaker earlier. But this, for many, signaled a new beginning for Zimbabwe. I asked the question, was it a new beginning or is it a false dawn? Dollarization killed inflation, but with it, destroyed the lives and hopes of so many people. However, dollarization allowed companies to start planning their activities again. Companies moved quickly to to recapitalize and to regrow their balance sheet. Total bank deposits at that time was $300 million. Government was receiving less than $5 million a month when we dollarized in 2009. Today, our fiscus receives something like $300 to $400 million a month. Post the formation of the GNU, Zimbabwe experienced very strong GDP growth. In fact, GDP reverted back to the Africa trend of 8%, and between 2009 and 2012, Zimbabwe experienced very good growth driven by mining and agriculture. It was a period of tremendous hope and optimism. But as the speaker earlier said, Zimbabwe implemented this policy of indigenization. And the policy of indigenization basically meant the transfer of 51% of the ownership of companies from foreign-owned companies into local indigenous people. With that, the dreams once again, of many non-indigenous people in Zimbabwe were shattered. Where are we today? We're following the elections of July 2013, in which ZANU-PF gained a landslide victory. The stock market fell 11% within 2 days. Since then, the economy has been in free fall. And I expect GDP to decline for the first time since dollarization. According to the IMF, GDP will be around 3%, but I suspect that Zimbabwe will enter a period of negative GDP growth. The question to ask ourselves, will Zimbabwe enter another protracted period of negative GDP growth like we experienced in the previous decade, or will it be different this time? The key issue facing Zimbabwe today is that politics continues to dominate at the expense of the economy. Where do we go from here? And I am hopeful. I'm a little bit different to other economists in Zimbabwe that you have to take a Prozac before you attend one of these. I'm slightly more optimistic, and I want to end with some optimism. I came back to Zimbabwe because I believe that Zimbabwe deserves better. I believe in a better Zimbabwe. And I believe that change starts with each and every one of you sitting here. Individually, you need to believe in a better Zimbabwe. Collectively, we need to believe in a better country and a better future for this country. When we start doing that, the collective vision and the collective belief will have a huge transformative effect on this country. Zimbabwe does have tremendous potential. The fundamentals that Zimbabwe had in 1980, the fundamentals that Zimbabwe had in 1990, in 2000, are very much intact. We still have a highly educated population. Our resources are still in the ground. But more importantly, what I realized during that period of hyperinflation is that Zimbabweans are resilient. Not only are Zimbabweans educated, but they're enterprising and they're resilient. No country would have survived what Zimbabwe endured during that period of hyperinflation. Zimbabwe is a peaceful country, despite all the political uncertainty. And we have great weather. Winds of change. I do believe we're entering a period of change. Despite all the pessimism, I remain optimistic. Africa is rising and Zimbabwe needs to play catch-up. I expect And this is where I'm going to end. I expect that over the next decade, Zimbabwe will be the fastest growing economy in Africa, and quite possibly the fastest growing economy in the world. And that change starts here. That change starts with you. I'd like to end with a quote, and it's something that inspired me to come back to Zimbabwe, having spent 10 years in London, working at the world's largest endowment, the Wellcome Trust, where I was responsible for $27 billion. I came back to a country whose GDP was less than $7 billion. My family, including my wife, thought I was absolutely mad. But I followed my heart, and I followed my heart back to Zimbabwe. And I draw inspiration from this poem, which was written by William Henley, the 18th century. And it says, I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. It's time we hold ourselves to account. It's time we believe in a better Zimbabwe. Thank you.